Teshe delay. So yesterday when you heard your introduction to the visual system, we talked a lot about how light enters the eye and is converted into electrical signals in the retina.
아니 계산 아주 통솔 말라디 모두 치루아스 디나 치 키란조 카리셰 라와나 요데 믹나 칸데스 주구메다 안타나시 믹나 레서젤 록달라 칸데 주구메 디코르셰 로아스.
And also you learned about this very complicated neural circuit that's just in the retina that processes those visual signals before it leaves the eye.
안단다 미기나 단다 믹말레몬 단다 미기 단다 제웨 니추망부주 로아스디 예세 칸데 치유메 창마 안 타기나라 조당디 창마 키란조 세우지 하고 투 로아스케서.
And remember, there are two types of photoreceptors, the rods and the cones, and they each process light in a different way. One for low-level light, the rods, and the other for bright daylight and color vision, the cones.
다 단다 웰렌 타봉날 차샤나 키란조 디나 리민도 코 장요로스 디나 지 카리차들라나 외당 충에 갑수 칠레치기 디로 차샤나 단다 용입 타봉디 차되로스 안용입 타봉도 차샤나 요당 체외 차샤나 닝공도 니메공도 딘데기 요당라 단다 네수딘조 랭에체 안타나시 카도기 단다 예세칭에 디 차되로스.
And I hope that I convinced you yesterday afternoon that there's a lot of processing that goes on after the retina, and the evidence for that is in part visual illusions.
다든다 다티 예세 체주라 디코르다치 먼저 타기 젤라 니수도단디 다틴 도단디 됴소아스 딜라두고라 아니 먼저 단다 지 카리다 데베 데시게르라나 춘앙케사 됴니 디냠도 세우차이레스.
So today we're going to leave the retina and follow the visual pathway all the way up to the primary visual cortex, V1.
다든다 통솔 ngarim 말라레주라 디보도 단다 니수 단다 타기 니치니 야도두고라 통솔기 귤람주라 디코르시엔 레스타리.
And we'll talk at the end of today's classes about one of the most interesting and mysterious problems that neuroscientists have struggled with, and that's called the binding problem.
다든다 왕자 체리발라 강이 직퇴되어레스 디 강이 콜라니 젤셰이스 딜라니 binding process 라니다 binding 라나 디로 차고르지 냠부 자르와르지 디게 아니 그림 딘데지 기어레스 강이 지카뇨치.
So the problem is this, that our visual system processes color, motion, form along separate pathways all the way up to the primary visual cortex.
다든다 ngarim 통솔 말라주르스 디보도 단다 ngarim 통솔 말라르와 디보도 단다 다틴 두유르스 디토도 당아주 카도 임바이나레 카도 다데이나레 타나시 요구단 데와이나레 넘바다 데와이나레 라디야 니수두두고라 아니 랑가디 귤럼디 로가 차데레스.
So if that's true, then where is that information put together into a complete, seamless perception of the world around us?
딘데 임바이나 단다 귤럼 로가 요르라워스 젤라 카왈라 아니 냠도 쿠란조 냠도 찍라 두요르스 레베나 안가조 두셰케 조라스 디 냠도 두에 조라 창마 냠도 디 칸데스 충구요레스란 디 티오딜리요레스 레두 귤럼 로가 레체 젤라 단다 마림 디슌 딜레두 갈라 레발라 레두 갈라 두셰케 조라 냠도 두니 디 칸데스 기요르란 디 티와 차도요레스.
And it looks like from studies of the visual system that visual information, color, form, and motion is only combined together to create a single perception of the world at very high levels of visual processing.
다단다 통솔다 저 예세 시 규림 조라 디케제 시오에나스 당아주 카도 임바이나레 아니 요구 임바이나레 아니 남바이나레 라호보 칸데지나 치 코리오고지 디 네주 상말레니 젤라 단다 림베토 레베난레두와라 상만냠도 니주 상만냠도 뒤니 두셰케 조라스 디차요레스.
And so we call something when we teach in the United States, we say the take-home message. So the take-home message of the lectures today is that visual processing is carried out through parallel streams until a very late stage of processing in the visual cortex.
tanda tongso relation ba de mala kon la koran su gi todang gi langa chura ni su di tongso da te ni su di todu kala nyam do ro ju res di relation di mala ba de tongso da te relation mala ba ta di kran su ta ngazo ari do cha sha na ne du ke che chi nang la ki dwe la ji chi shi gi res take home message le di ro cha de res ne du di inji mi ji nya gu res ni su dwe nyam do du yo ro che nyam do ro che and gang le du samanyam du do relation da de tanda tonsor da de relation le du samanyam du le res du res.
So the big picture question really is, how does the brain do this? How does the brain combine color and motion and form so that when we pick up a red ball, we don't see red as separate from the shape of the ball, the roundness of the ball?
Lebe gi tanda neju dige samale logo level le du wala samanyam du res la ran nesu di datin samanyam du khandes du res an chesa dinde nyam du kengi ngara su gi ngoboji ya kya ka su polo ji kya wa na polo digi namba khari me ani i gogo imba che khado ma wo imba chama nyam du nesu du tu dos dile du gal nesu logo polo la ni loga che an khado ma wo la ni loga di nesu loga chag mu dos samanyam du dos dile be khande chi tu res.
So I want you to keep that big question in mind, because we're going to be talking about many different stages of visual processing.
Ta kera zo themba na sha gu res chi dikharla na thana ngazu ge ta tonsor da de ne su dodang gyurim jura ta tin dodang de dinala ani rimba mangu shu res.
And it's really easy to get lost in all the information and lose sight of the big picture.
Cheza ani tinde rimba korim na dugi chidu wala ani mara zo ne su kabre khachi lana thomne ani ne su ke che den zo ni shodu res.
So today, by the end of today, if I can get through it all, you should understand how visual information, how perception is produced, both at the level of the visual cortex, or V1, and you should understand some aspects of parallel processing. In particular, I'm going to be talking about motion and shape or form, how objects are recognized and how motion is detected.
Ta da ngazu chi tonsor da de du she khandes ki yu mejura di ke su di por shi res tharin lotina an chi tonsor gi du she gozom sa de ani tonsor gi ngarim le shu khu jura di ne res and di undi le shu gi khu di la V1 la yu res. Thana shi tongzo da dewe an chajin nam teshib nga ani yeju cheju jura nyel nezu dodang di yeshib thon dugu res la di khande simbal khare dani kham parini da dewe war tishara. Thana shi ani yu gi ngobu nam an chida ngoda chuyu me di khande chuyu ache gujyo da ani khado da namba da dinde ri khande shizor chuyu me di kanrish.
So you've seen this before.
Di keran zungo la thongsa roas remudi.
This is a diagram of the human brain, and many parts of the brain have been removed so that you're seeing the visual pathway laid out from the eye to the visual cortex.
Tanda di parji do remudi. Kyabla shungi din singde. Ane this sketches tanda di parji do di par di lebe par res ra. And dinala tanda chashi mangche changri yo mares. Tanda kharina na dina chashi meksukani khari gitne she lawa na tongzor mala da dewi chashi jura dige tne she res. Chega tongzor mala gi chashi mashi chashi shimba de dina changri yo mares.
So here are the two eyes. Remember, this is called the optic nerve as it leaves the eye and goes to the optic chiasm. Optic nerve.
Ta tanda di mig dirwas migredi. And dine ni sa ji thungda sti mi gi wangza the rest optic nerve di and dine ni chigli and ni ga ni u dos til ne sam the rest.
And here in the back of the eye, just this thin sheet of neural tissue is the retina.
Ta tanda mi gi gap de ta wai nas mi gridi de lo khar dulana phumrup ta prab ji thungu dos seuj dine ma jo thaki di rest.
The only neuron to send its axon out of the retina is the retinal ganglion cell.
다단다 다게 사진 뚱이기 왕자 타수 거리 차들라나 먼저 자기 자기 데 왕자 자두 주라 디게레스.
And the retinal ganglion cells send their axon into the optic nerve. And as you know, some of those axons cross at the chiasm to the other side of the brain, and other axons stay on the same side of the brain.
다단다 디 미기 왕자 딜리로스 디네 레서 에젤라 네섬 딜리레스. and 디네 니차지 콜 두르라와이나 네섬 디게니 두르레스. 초심바 레베 초심바들라. and 요만이 레서 예베 초 두르레스. 아니 차지 콜 두르라나 초 태아란 데디게레스 요만아.
Most of the axons travel through the optic tract, so it's optic nerve, optic chiasm, then optic tract to the lateral geniculate nucleus.
다단다 디네니 왕자 미기 왕자 딜리레스 아니 망쳐 콜 게두르라와이나 단다 네좀 디게니 두르레스 왕자디 아니 차지 콜 리르라와이나 단다 디 랑과지다 딜 아니 믹제 달람로 미기 달람로 차려레스 optic tract 체 and didn't call you Loana, Langele should leave rest.
And from the lateral geniculate nucleus, the axons, these neurons send their axons up to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe.
Langele should any ones that has to Mambush to restaurant. The daggets are tension. Daggets are in the Mambush Tunguris, the daggets are in the call to Lawaina, Marin Tonsor Malajuras, the Chashid to rest.
So scientists call this the retino-geniculocortical pathway. But remember that Professor Yvonne talked about two other projections from the retina, one to the pretectum and one to the superior colliculus. And we did a little experiment yesterday in class shining light into one eye, one of your eyes, and the observation is that when light is shined into the eye, a bright light, the pupils will constrict. And this is what happens when we go from the classroom out into bright sunlight. And that constriction of your pupil not only protects your eye, but also helps you see better in bright light. Then when you come back inside the classroom, your pupil constricts again because the light it's darker in here. And this happens hundreds of times a day, and we're not even aware of it. This is not part of conscious vision. It's one of those many aspects of body function and sensation that occurs without our awareness. The other pathway shown here is to the superior colliculus, a structure in the midbrain. Colliculus means little hill, and when you look at the midbrain, they look like tiny little hills sitting on the top of the midbrain.
그런저 콜리큘러는 리춘주를 고고 res 다 딜라도 레베기 기기네시도 발기네 딜타도 갈라 부르소 텐데디오 res 리춘주 나시.
And this part of the visual system, which is also below the cortex, is involved in orienting our eyes and our head towards objects in our environment.
디네디 콜르라는 레베기 월레스 디기 카릴 로버치고로나 아주 뭐보든지 거의 메텔라 아주 고디 야마 유구치요라 스틸 핑기요레스.
Have you ever been seated and intensively studying something in front of you, and you notice in the corner of your eye, you notice out here something is moving across the floor? Has this ever happened to you? And without helping it, you turn and look to make sure it's not a rat or a snake or a cockroach.
다 키란조다 베제로 로데요 갑수 슈지다 투낭 슈치니 로데요 갑수 카브리 다 타야다 딜 베제딜다 데 라스 투낭 슈치니 카브리 타네지 요구치 구조 당겨 로지 통도스 데데 중용 US 데데 요구치 로지 초아장 빌람상 안조 파타기 로스 디 파타도 갈면조 다 두이다 지지다 데데 부리 디메나사 메타기 로스.
Yeah, so that's the pathway from the retina to the superior colliculus is concerned with how we orient our head and our eyes and also our bodies to objects in space around us.
단다 자기니 디마 미자 디테니 단다 디 부르수 공마디가 루도스 디기 카리 핑규를 나와나 귤음디기 말아서 단다 치 모보 한데메 디 초콜레메 다디 말아서 태주라 믹치부 구조다에 치고 많이 수부 차상 아주 디 초르태주라 가져대디 딜 핑규레스.
So here's a hard question for you. Why would nature design a system like this that would cause us, when something's moving out in the periphery, would cause us to turn our eyes and our head towards that object?
다단다 통조 말라디 켄기 따직 요구 치와 통도 갈랑 아주 미다 소부 참마 파조 따기 요르와스 뭐고 요구 치사디 디엔 통조 말라디데 가진 차레스.
So what's the functional significance of this lower visual pathway?
딜라데타 디 마린기 단다 통조 그림 지어라 돌람디 디게 아니 케베 가리 요레스 가진 케좀 차기 요레스디. Because our visual field is limited, that's why we have to move our head to focus at that particular object.
That's exactly right. That's precisely right. So when we turn our head and our eyes to look at something, we bring that image into the center of our retina, into the fovea region. So we're now looking at that object was out here, we're now looking at it with our fovea. And once we are using our central vision, our fovea, which has a very high density of cones, we then are analyzing that object using our geniculocortical pathway. So, in this way, the visual system is like a very finely tuned machine that allows us to go from bright light into dark and still see, and to be able to use peripheral vision to orient ourselves to something and then identify objects. And it all works seamlessly together without us being aware of it. So now let's turn to the retinogenicular-cortical pathway and try to begin to dissect the different aspects of how we see form and motion.
Tanda di gulam jido di thola ani lolo chik chik ideshini gurim di khali me to da jura di ani seo chini dwes khado da yogu da de kon.
So just to remind you, the axons leave the retina, travel in the optic nerve, and either cross at the chiasm or stay on the same side of the brain. So now we've got a very simple drawing of the retinal pathway, and this is the lateral geniculate nucleus.
Tanda di parji tendo as di tab de ro tendo res mi lo zo migri da tendo chimbu tendo di chunju so she do res di mi yoma che yeba che mi nyin di che andi thagi di che thagi ni thembe tanda da ge sa ten di res andi kila chik ne do di ne so migze ne so di res dene ma le de di kharala na di tanda the langi le sho ju di res.
When the early neuroanatomists first looked at this part of the brain, it reminded them of a knee. And genu in Latin means knee.
Tadana dil genucleate lan lagdas genu la thani jidas dil khar la orla na jo pimul la res anjo seriba de jo thambota da khari do thon la na pimul do thon res chesan di ming di tasheres.
So if you were to take this part of the human brain and make sections through it, very thin sections through the brain, and then stain them to see the different cell layers, it might look something like this.
The lebegi chashira, lebog tamushu shaway nasra, shani and Honzuta and Tona Handili Launa, and the Dilton Shadadi res.
And so what you can see is that there are layers, and they've been numbered. Layer 1, Layer 2, Layer 3, Layer 4, Layer 5, Layer 6.
And then the Tona Dinja Dinana Kartungur and Rimba Dosh Tungu dos, Kurim Dosh dos, Di Rimba Dilani, Ming Tasheres, Rimba Tambo, Niwa, Sumba, Shioma, Tubol and Tasheres.
The two inner layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus have really big neurons.
Tatana Nangi Rimba Nish dos, and the Lesho di Ra. You
can't see it very well in this picture, but these neurons are much bigger than the neurons in these layers marked P. And these two inner layers marked M, layers 1 and 2, those big neurons really care about motion or moving stimuli. And they get input from the left and the right eyes. From the left and the right eyes. But that input isn't mixed together. It's segregated into separate layers so that layer 1, that cares about motion, gets input from the opposite side of from the opposite eye. Layer 2 gets information from the eye on the same side of the brain as that lateral geniculate. So these two layers, and there's another geniculate nucleus on the other side of the brain, it's not shown here. These two layers process information about stimuli that are moving across our visual field. And they contain a map of the visual field. The other 4 layers, 3, 4, 5, and 6, have tiny neurons in them.
다 단다 림바 당고 뉴디나라 온자 타수 첨부 열라라 다 숨바 시왕어 두바 디실라 온자 타수 된주 충와이레스.
And so the P stands for parvocellular, but it just means that the neurons are small.
다 단다 디 필라니 티도아시기 디 parvocellular 라오레스 디 튼다 카르 라오라나 안데 디 타수 된주 온자 타수 된주 춘주 열라고레스 튼다.
And they also get input from both eyes. The parvocellular layers, 3, 4, 5, and 6, also get input from the left eye and the right eye on each side of the brain.
다 대원나시 시와 뉴 숨바 시와마 투바 도스 디시나라게 당보다 뉴나시 미 예바다 요마니가 니네술리기 레스 디시라.
And what these neurons are interested in or care about is color and shape or form.
다 덴조 왕자 차수시도 디 가리다 되어 차되어 라와나 입체 아니 넘버체 안 카도 디다 되어 차되어 레스.
And so we can say that even at this first synapse from the retina to the thalamus, the lateral geniculate nucleus, the visual system is separately processing information about where something is and what something is.
다들 투점 찍이 바이나에 단도에 통절 말라디기다 모보디 거유메다 가리메디 하고 요루아스.
So these just for short, we call these the M and the P pathway.
다단다 디 가리코르레 라오나 M다 P 귤럼나 나게 레스트라.
And these neurons that are located in the thalamus send their axons up to the primary visual cortex.
다디 단다 레보나 요에기다 테닝데 차도 로스 디게 에네네 수디 단다 다틴디 콜 당겨 라오나 한 루슈마린 통소 루슈인데 당겨 레스.
So now in this picture, we're looking at someone's head from this angle, the left side of the head.
다디 파르지 도스 디 리무디 가리 춘겨 라오나 쇼네 타오니 윤 쇼네 타교디 리시 통겨 레스.
And the cortex is transparent, so we can see through it.
아니 레슌지 도스 디 에네 치세 나세 레스 디 라도 먼저 디 균이 통통이 로스.
And so you can see the eye, the optic nerve, the optic tract, the lateral geniculate, and then the pathway up to the primary visual cortex.
아니 디 미로스 미디네 디네 미기 왕자디 레스디 안데네 체길 항일레 쇼르리 레스라 체길 항일레 쇼니 다친디 미기 초자디네니 홀리 라오나 통저기 마르블레션 델리기 도스 디 귤람 디디 레스.
Do you remember what this is called? The name for this?
디라 카르 라기 어팅기 되서 민디 라 카레 나답 딱답 occipital lobe.
Occipital lobe is back here, and this is the optic radiation. Optic radiation.
단다 디 다마 카르 란티미도 다마 디다 디 단다 딱답 드레스 디 카르 라나 optic radiation 미기 토자 라디레스.
What structure is this?
디 차시즈 디 카르라스 라 Ling cerebellum.
Cerebellum. And where's the temporal lobe?
Murgon leshe hoyerlas. Murgon damma hoyeres.
This is the temporal lobe.
Murgon damma yo.
And when I
Murgon
talk-
leshu lanare damma ta damma ra thanda di res.
temporal lobe. When I talked about the somatosensory cortex, that's located right here.
Ta thanda anzo lusur da dewe leshu juas di khawayer lawana dele res ne.
And just in front of it is the motor cortex.
And yogu da dewe thanda leshu juas di khandir lana di dun tishto di res.
So when we talk about vision and the information reaching the primary visual cortex, it's important to keep in mind that around the primary visual cortex are additional visual cortical areas, 10, 15, or 20 or more different visual areas devoted to analyzing what we're seeing, color, form, and motion.
다다다 디 미기 troza di deleni lesa di thongzor ngarin gelishun dirwas di ne dela thongzor ngarin gelishun lagiwas di thongzor da jaw chagiyores di ne di khu di chipu maimba di la nyombe thande ya thongzor da dewe ya ne khu di ge yores and khu page 15 to 20 areas.
But generally, we think of primarily 5 primary and secondary visual cortical areas.
Tadina la ngarim da ani thanda niba do laura leshun thanda thongzor da dewe leshun lani di chipu maimba thande dina yores.
And those visual areas extend in 2 directions, this direction and this direction.
Tadanda thongzor da dewe leshun gi thanda ne khu di zo yor la roas di khawla khab der la na khu dige da dewa la khab yores.
What we know about the organization of the primary visual cortex is that it contains a map of the visual world around us.
Tadanda di leshun di da khari dewa thongzor leshun di khari dewa chagor la na mara so bi chi ngo bota chi khoru na la khari yeme gi sara do jora di ani hakotu yores di juni.
And when we're talking about the primary visual cortex, or V1, most of that map is located in the cortex is located between the left and the right hemispheres, on the medial side of the hemisphere.
Tadanda kurani tanda leshun ni joras ne tawa na khawla khedir la na di yuen di da yela tawa na tanda dumche gi parma rosh da di ne do chadures.
So what I want you to imagine in the next slide is that we now have cut the brain down the midline, and we're now looking at the medial surface of the cortex.
The slide jema joras dina khariur la na lebe kini dine shasha chi ani khachin tawa na 100 millions.
So in this image, we're looking at the left side of the brain, but we're looking at the medial surface. And this is the right side of the brain, and we're looking at the medial surface.
Tadanda di moy di khari chayla na ki choji da lebe di chadures di yoma di che di dumche yeba dires.
And what the diagram is explaining is that there's an orderly representation of the world. And so what this means is that the neurons from the lateral geniculate nucleus project in an orderly fashion, an orderly manner up to the visual cortex so that they maintain spatial relationships.
Tadanda tangi leshu juras dine ni wangza dinzo kurim dikdan la ura di jodan di thanda leshu thongzor gingarim leshu bodu joya jura kurim ro jures koran su dikdan.
So imagine now this circle, these 3 circles represent 3 areas of the visual world. From the biggest circle is most of our visual field, then smaller and smaller.
Tangazo thongzor gi rawa jura di chungyo restel gogo sumdo ta di ani ngazo thongzor gi rawa thalo yo che di cheshu di chadyo ras andi jela ki di ani gogo di chungyo res andi susu di di chungyo res.
So 1 and 2 are the central fovea, or the central regions of the world that we look at in the left visual field.
Tadanda yuan cho del tawa na thongzor rawa del thangbo da niwa jidwas di khari chungyo la ngazo thongwe gi tanda mobu ki jura da arazo thoyandi ki di chungyo res thongjo di.
And because the retinal ganglion cell axons from the part of the retina that sees this cross to the other side of the brain at the chiasm, that region of the visual world is analyzed, left visual field is analyzed in the right visual cortex.
Tadanda yuni lewa juras di nesu di leni tanda migi nelsam juwa wangze nelsam di geni khol ni lawana lebe ye chojdo thangbunyo del ligu res dela nesu di zo yeship chigu res di.
And in contrast, the central region of the right visual field is analyzed in the left visual cortex over here.
Theanashi ye choni lengyo juras di datindi ani yeship khol chigu lawana 유엔초들 치료레스.
The adjacent regions of the right visual field, so 7 is the upper right visual field, is represented in the lower left visual cortex.
만 타나신 아주 통솔로 나가 네 디지도 딱 두바게도디. 디기 네 다진 디 콜리 라와나 디 아니 디 쳬라 레베기 네 두바 쳬도 디 쳬유레스.
So without worrying too much about the details, the important message is that the right side of our visual cortex, the right visual cortex, is analyzing information about the left side of visual space.
다른데 쉽다 쉬우지 그런 좋다 심리 치고고요 말했다. 저 가르쳐들 라와나 레베 이해 초지도 디기 가리 예시 치고라나 미 유엔초기 네스윌링 조저라 디 예시 치고레스.
And conversely, the left visual cortex is analyzing information about the right side of our visual world.
타나시니 레베기 예레 예시라다 유엔초디 가리 예시 치고라나 미 예베니 레베 타나조 통해주라 디 네스윌링 예시 치고레스.
And some of you, if you're paying attention, may have noticed that the upper visual fields are analyzed in the lower part of the visual cortex, and the lower visual field is analyzed in the upper visual cortex.
다 디나레 치 가리올로나 통조르기 단다 라와주로스 디나레 강라 유디가지 예십 칭에디 가리차들라나 디나 와디 차기도 왔어. 통조르기 라와 강디르도 디고 원디 레베 이네디 따와이나 춘지디 와라 차기오레스.
So the fovea is analyzing, the foveal region is analyzing the central part of visual space.
당주 통중주라 통중디기 가리 예십 치고 라와나 통조라와기 끼를 유주라니디 통조라와기 끼디 디에니 예십 치고레스 니지.
And remember, you learned that this is where you have many, many more cone cells.
제사 디 균체를 따내 알아주기 통중디나라 안용이 타고 망보요레스.
And so it's interesting that in the visual cortex, much more space is devoted to analyzing the center of the visual world.
딜라디타 탄다 디나 차샤와나 디 시와다 보디 딜라디 디코라 네 망아심 도아스 먼저 통조르기 라와나 따와나 키주라 딜네 망아테레스.
And for all the peripheral space, the periphery of our visual field, very little space in the visual cortex is devoted to analyzing that.
따디 통조르레슌 차위로와 디나 따디 발라타 키기 초주라 시와다 수마르디디 통조르레슌기 사자따와나 망알린 도아스. 아니 디 통조르레슌 사자 충아디 가리 렌데라와나 타네기 통조라와 주로아스 디게 미술랭이디 차리레스.
So what this shows is that the brain devotes more space, more area to analyzing form in our central visual fields. So this is very useful for identifying what we're looking at.
따तना 아주 가을 따기 유메 가릴 따기 유메 줘라 디 넘버 디 하고 개침부 차기에서 아주 레벨 나갔다 와야게 갸크 페시어 가릴 렌들라나 기기 라 통주로 어디 니디 순제디 차디레스.
Okay, are there any questions so far about what I've just told you?
따 탄다고도 루티치라스 디 토라 히런서 치오유에스.
근데 그 통선에서 요라 근데 뭐지 처방이나 뭐지 처방이나 되게 통통들이 이 소방에서 나사는 요라를 요만해
믹직 요나
뭐지 처방이나
믹직 좀 봐이나 믹직 내와이나서 믹직랑 요와이나서
뭐 지금 아까매나 다르다 그 통선에서 있는데 차시간 요라 차시간 요만해 이 무슨 찬양을 해서 가는 단지
ale 믹직 마시메 와이나 디 귤럼 디 도다 디 칸데스 두 레스라. So he wants to know like if a person is has only one eye, is blind from the one part of the eye, so what do that person see? So how does this visual system work?
If the person is completely blind in one eye, then they can see most of the world. So if they're blind in the right eye, all you have to do is shut your right eye to tell what it would look like. So shut your right eye.
다 믹직 마시 믹직 롱와이 마이너스 라라 다 딜로도 키란주 믹직 좀 바이나 디로 차요 라스 믹직 마시 마라스니 디 칸데 통고에 메디 키란주 믹직 좀 니타다스
What can you not see?
가레 통통 윈도스 아게
What is missing?
가레 창가 윈도스 남주 믹니 기타야 줘라 나는 믹직 가도 갈라 직 마상 가리 마상 도스
That's right. That's right. The far peripheral. So if you're blind in the right eye, you just can't see this part of the visual world.
Yes, the migieba di longwa imbinas, manzo tongzor gita nizu lianjura, di cho de ni tu yomaras, di tsang yomares.
That's a good question.
Tio di abudus.
Di nangzin sura. Di nangzin daga yo di ko ayan tsang di ko kai da yo. Di sa ka sara. Di sa ka sana ko yo di ko mara. Di nangzin ko de pa ga daga chini
Maybe you can repeat the questions because he didn't have the microphone.
간디긴 내수디.
이게 돌아가 되는 데다 자기 예 방나와. 이게 돌아가 되는 방식이 내시죠.
아니 디긴 내수 리엔주라디 내수디 누구요 말와스다. So when a person is blind in the left eye, so the information which usually comes from the left eye, which goes to the part of the brain, how is that missing or what? If the person is blind in the left eye.
Is missing.
Res nesu di duyo marilas. Namjo nesu tanda yomani lenjura. Di pajo duyo ras nesu di. Tanda kandes res la nesu duyo riyo mares lan tira. Nesu di lao res la nesu di tsangyo mares.
But both eyes, left and the right eye, have an overlap in what they can see in the center of the visual field. So my right eye can see this part of the visual field, and my left eye, this one, can see this part of the visual field. And in the middle, there's an overlap. So when we lose one eye, we only lose a little bit of our ability to see the world.
Tadanda niga yoa nasra. Mig eba khari thongso rawadi khari chadyorlana di chadyorwas. Yomegi rawadi khari yewegi rawadi di chadyorwas. Yomegi rawadi dibas chadyorwas. Dilado niga chiga chik tsegi doas ki rodena. But mikchik masawa inas ra mikchik longwa chawa inas nesutis masawa chagres pecho yores.
But another important thing that when we lose one eye, or vision in one eye, another important ability that we lose is the ability to see in depth. And this is called stereopsis.
Tadanda mikchik longwa chawa na chik kange chik khari tiyo lawana manzo ina mobodi sablo khaba sume di shetu yorwas dig nibodi mewa chagres.
When you look at a microscope, you're using your two eyes, and you can see better with the two eyes because you see in depth. And that information from the two eyes isn't combined at the level of the LGN. It's kept separate. Left eye, right eye, different layers in the LGN. And it's not until these neurons project up into the primary visual cortex that we begin to see neurons that respond to information from the left eye and the right eye. Those are binocular neurons.
Dilada tanda di nesudi ya leshu badu male badu ngaran sugita nesudi tanda taso kandila ni nesu yomani lido ni yomani lido lajura di tongu yores.
Next question.
Ngal troje tada ani ngarus garsan mi yamba tikta ina ani tik danti te ani te leva yomba chondro da ani yamba tikta na di dante di yamba shundo la ro ti la ani tini dante de ko karsana ni leba ne so ndo ani kono karsana duye she ro da de den duye she ndo kono ne so ani duye zeta de ni dunya dante she yore wese o te chi
dushi ki ros andi jela
ye zeta de la ro tani ta de ni she yore wese duye ni duye ko karsana leba ne so ya shodo yo she nindo o tine ga dani ye yo ni ga nani duye dani ta de ni she yore wese de dane chi dro chi de karsana be da ngar so ben de da mi de da ro di ye ba de ni be ka ka ro ba di ye ba de ni ka ma bo na di dane so ani ko sa le ba de so di ne ka dani ka sa di duye ni ani dunya de ani bin ani ro
kandes di kaw ton di ma ton ne su di level du ros andi jela
yamba de karsa mi yamba de kawo thong ro oya ka da de ro tan de zone di yamba de ani karsa ka do kawo ro thong di yamba de ma bon ro thong ro di ani karsa duye de ani leban ro ta kala dan de leban ro di ne ga za ne leban ne ani karsa na kun duye she ade ani zeta di karsa kala ta dunya che da ani rinji kan ra che res
दुशे खंडे की रेस ला रे दुशे खंडे जी की रेस रे दुशे मिंटो की रोया लसो की यर ला की रेस काओ जिता माउस द दुशे मिंटो नी की यर रे रो की रेस अंडी चला अले तुझे चिगले की यर रे ना लोगन तुझे लेके बा यर रेस रो तो ताऊ दिखा रहे थे तुझे जो बोला ले दुशे नी की यर रे ना ती ची यर रेस रो. So you said like this part of the eye perceives the vision, world vision from the left part, from the right part, from this part, and this part receives the information from this side, right? And it goes to the other part of the brain. So does it mean that we are perceiving two different things at the same time? Do we have two perceptions at the same time, or is it what is it? What is it? Like after having like two information from both sides.
So it's a good question. So why don't we see two halves of the world? In fact, we don't. And the visual cortex brings those perceptions together so that the visual world is seamless and we don't have a separation in the middle of it. So in fact, our visual system takes care of that. We don't see two things at once. Our perception is that this is a complete, seamless visual world without any gaps in it.
아니 내수 직수 시료레스 딜라도 두시 직레스 로가 로가 차직 차가라니 딘데 통해 딘데 기요 말레스 부시 상만님도 두시료레스 디 통솔 말라기 시시료레스 딜라가데.
So part of the reason that is the case is that between the two hemispheres we have axons that connect them called the corpus callosum. It's a bridge of fibers that connect the left and the right visual cortex.
안직 탄다 가서 통솔 레슈 여러와스 통솔 레슈 기네 데 레섬 탄다 레섬라니 차시 주여와스 디기 탄다 레베 레돔차 이에디 돔체 이에디다 윤디 투여레스디 디다게 차전디 차비여레스 레섬 투미니.
If you want to see two things at the same time, push on one of your eyes.
다 투즈직라 니 통통고 요나라스다. 만도 안디 믹덴데 디가 nemdas.
Just push on one eye.
Mik chigal nem da sa inde.
Don't shut it, just push it.
Mik chungu marilas ani indis nem da las this.
Push on the side of your eye.
Thala mik thala this into nem da las.
So now, when you push on your eye, now you're making your eye go a little bit this way and the other eye is looking straight ahead. You see two things.
Take di nem ge ras. Di nem du khaju lana mik di this yogu the ras kujo tani. And di mik di gi this phajo thongu res di mik di khatu thongu ras cheza ni thongu res. And to you di mik kau da mau ta di laure. Okay.
And the reason that we don't normally see two different parts of the visual field is that our eyes are always working together to bring objects into the center of our retina, the fovea.
Cheza mik ni di la chi du khadu na nyam du ta ngo bo chil ta na nyam du ta ge res. Khai di ta wa na ani ne su di sangma ta thin di majo thongju rang la phogo ras khatu di che res. And there is another question, the second question from the same monk. So he said, when you place an object here, and your right eye is looking at a white object, and left eye is looking at the red object. So both this information is passed on to the brain, and it perceives two different things. So does the brain perceive these two different things simultaneously or at different times?
Right. So have you ever looked through the eyepieces of a microscope?
An thadong chi shi nan mik thandang zo yuni ta yo dine ne ni pheju chi ni ta nyong yo es thadong chi shi pheju chi nyong ra changma.
Did you see two things or one thing?
Ta thanda ni ta ro as zo mik ta di da du gala ngo bo ni thong do ngo bo chik thong do
One. So your brain puts that information, separate information, together.
Chezan keran zo leba di khari chi go launa ni su min da ni le do res hine chik lo du she lo res lebege.
And I think what he's imagining is that when you look through your left eye at the right eye, they have slightly different views of the same object. Your left eye is, because of the distance between your two eyes, each eye has a slightly different view of an object. And that's called disparity.
No, he said he's looking at two different objects.
Oh, two different objects. So
if you place something in between two eyes, and this right eye is looking at white object, and this left.
Oh, looking at two different objects. Right, so in that case, if the two eyes are looking at two different things, if you could show one thing to one eye and a different thing to the other eye, it would be very confusing to your brain. It would be very confusing to your brain.
Ta mik chik dila ngobo chik de mik shemba del ngobo shemba de ta di ka do shera di imba na ta ngobo ni mik lo lo ita de ras dila de ni level la khalbo ngobo chagi res di kapso.
And what your brain will try to do is put that together, and it will try to fuse those images into one image, if it can.
And leba gi Quran gi khang tu do la ora leba gi khar chi la na thanda ngobo ni gi ne su ni jo ras din ne su ni di chik de thapshi chi res leba gi.
Okay, one more question if there is one, and then I'd like to go on.
So you don't perceive two things, right?
You do. Oh, you do.
So red and white.
You could have.
Because you said both these informations are.
Yeah, well, a better example is if one eye is looking over here and the other eye is looking over here. Very different things. Then it's very confusing to the brain. And this happens in certain disorders, like some children are born with an eye that turns in or an eye that turns out. And this is very confusing to the brain, and the brain will eventually, in those children, suppress information from one of those eyes. So the child will effectively only be looking through one eye.
Dilodita thanda mik lo ta jura dike shoina dinde yores naza nishi le po po into yores dinde na cha shadu mik chik di yama gu jo tan phata chik di phata in che yores di kangi thedu gola ne mik chik mig ni ni chik di khaji la na me ba nyam ni chik di nem ni ro mig chik pheju me ju chagu res chal mig chik rang ya chig res kangi de thi res bu dum zura.
Since I've been here, I've noticed some of the monks have this condition. It's called strabismus. One eye turns out. So in some cases, what we learn to do is first use one eye and then use the other eye. So this is also possible. But in either case, the visual system will only use information coming from one eye because the two combined is too confusing.
Tatanda kashi lakangi yo resti tanda mig chik di yama gujo tang yor lai jora niga chik la mata eri di kangi thidu wala ani ngonzo di china digi yo res mig chik tsum lan mig chik ta yan chik tsum chik ta che yo res di mai ban nam ju kuran mig niga dawn ko su khari yor law na leba la ko nyong bu chage yo res ine ni su ni ligi yo res niga lebe gi chik na digi yo res.
And another example is if you have blurry vision in one eye and very good vision in the other eye. So if you need glasses in one eye, and vision through that eye is very blurry, the brain will suppress that, your visual system will suppress the blurred information and selectively use the information coming through the eye that can focus and see things clearly.
Chezada danda mig ngaran so mig ni gida thoya gi nibo lo cha si ros kabre kharu lan mig yaga di mig chi gi yaga thoa che chi di sela masela thoya kangi thi dos dinde nazaro pho inas kangi yo inas ani anjo thonsor malai khar chi lo ina dine ne ne chu di seu shara li yo maras di man ne me thashi chi res ani yaga thoya se thoya joros di ne chu di len di res thonsor malai.
And those changes, those functional changes, don't occur at the level of the retina. They probably occur at subsequent levels of visual processing.
Di la du thanda ma jurim joya juda ma ne me di thanda ngajo thagi de yungu yo la na dil yungu yo mares di gi jela ngajo ta esel che jurim mangush tu yas dinal kheba tu res.
Okay, was there one more question?
And to chik in dasa ni di chik la handes dugo yo res laure. So he's saying like when one eye sees red color and the other eye sees white color, the brain perceives it as white and red separately. How can it combine these two together? Because these two are different. Because you said both this information are combined in the brain, right? So he's saying what? How can brain do this? Because these two are different, red and white. These two are perceived as white and red separately.
Perception occurs not at the level of the retina, but in the central visual pathways. So there are neurons in the primary visual cortex that are tuned to color. And that information coming from the two eyes is only combined in the primary visual cortex after the LGN, but at the next level up in the primary visual cortex, that red and white information would be combined, and there would be neurons that could respond to both. So they might combine it, for example, to see pink.
The rays kind of thanda manjo di chunga di thagi gana chungu yo mares dine ma gyuri ma du ras special na thanda tangi leshu gi je do cha sha nas dine ne lesu di khol tangri lo na thanda leshu na tangi ras thong so da te di leshu na le du wala an khoran so di ne su ni ga lingres kaw da ma ni le di ni ga le ni nyam du du res ne su di la du ani peje singer rosh thong gi res. He's saying we don't see pink. We see red and white separately.
Yeah. We could do the experiment.
Okay, what is that? She told us. Siu the Munguni Loga. So he is giving example of yellow and green color. So if these two information are combined, we should see blue color.
Oh. Okay, I understand what he's saying. So, in our retina, we have cone cells that are tuned to yellow-blue. And we have different cone cells that respond to red versus green.
Chik di kharida dewa cha deolana seo mumbu chasa chik di any red and green, right? And chik di kharida dewa cha deolana mao da jangu dewa cha res no yi thobundi.
And when they're all stimulated, we get the perception of white. It's all colors combined.
Ta dana yung yi thobung di changma kuma thewainas kuyin chungwainas ngajo dushe khari ki lana kawo imba dushe ki res.
It's also important to remember that whenever we are looking at something in the world, we're analyzing information about form as well as color.
Number form and shape or color. What did you say?
Color, form or shape.
Okay. Number in a re, kado in a re, even by the
and so what the neurons in the retina and the LGN care about is a border that might be blue or yellow or a border that's red or green. They look for a difference and an edge in color and shape. And in the visual cortex, there are separate neurons that just process information about color, and separate pathways for processing the information about motion, and separate neurons that process information about form. And those all have to be put together if we want to identify, let's say, a ball. If I were to throw a yellow ball, we would need to see that as a moving yellow shape. And that's all combined after the primary visual cortex.
Tanda nisu kado in binary, Tehanashi number the in binary, nobody E in binary. It's some Julam lower only rest lara, Wanza to lower watch had the rest rare. The any Pransugi, Nisu Dizulini, Tanda Nisu Sama Dubu Rastina, the Dua di Kadu Yungolana, Marim Kitonzo Malajura, Tonzo Gingari Maladi, Jella rest, Nisu Duedi. Mumbu Jangu Marpo Dilishimbi ha nele tabu yoma Kado shimba gi nele ba yoma wasra ani kado shimba denzo
kado shimba denzo pa no de nele tabu dachi che kundu was ati de meso sil mumbu jangu matu los kata
Kalis tonge resra. So we have only the photoreceptors for blue, red and green for these three colors. So how are we able to see other colors besides red, green and blue?
Yeah, so some animals have many more kinds of cone photoreceptors, and
He's talking about us. So how are we able to see different colors?
So I can begin to explain this over here. So the cone photoreceptors have a receptive field. A receptive field, just like remember in the somatosensory system, the receptive field is that part of the skin to which somatosensory receptor neuron can respond.
Anjo pabe thabu na thingi doas pabe ge thanda onsor ke she doala tina lo ons nele rawala ni she bas di do mara jo nyungi thabu lage khorangi nele rawa yores.
In the case of the cone cells, their receptive fields might be interested in the receptive field is circular, and there's usually a central region where red, for example, shining in the center of the receptive field excites the cell. Green, shining in the periphery of the receptive field, which is outside of that, will inhibit the cell. So when I put plus, it means red light excites the neuron. Green light inhibits the neuron. This is called color opponency. And we have all different combinations of color opponent cells in the retina. Red, green, blue, yellow, and other combinations.
자기는 차셔에 났었어. 디트도스 디탄다 넬링기로 디충규레스. 계시키 초디다 디나 마오타 갸도스. 마오 임바이나 안디기 구진 티유레스. 탈라 정부디기 가야 주라 구진 디카유레스. 야린치가. 근데 디트와 무튼이래 로거라. 니 무튼이래 산 저.
단다 단다 디 카도 단다 카도 말부터 정크 몸부 쓰미요라 때라 내내 제식 그게 내내때 스tig마토기 스마토 요마라 스마토면서 버그니스를 내내 지니 serpusewaji 통화이나 그 버긴 너네 데브줄지니 그 디고리서서 데브줄지니 디고세드나 serpu코로 원분 통이 tran토티 원부통 말부통 근데 쓴마도 그 쓴데 버게 신이 코츠바 데브줄지니 디게잡아 데르지르스 그 버긴 ser분 디게야데
디가 한데스 디게레스 라고. So we have only blue, green and red photoreceptors for these three colors. And when you said like we are able to see different colors because these informations are combined in the brain. So how are we able to see yellow color because we don't have photoreceptors for that? So how are we able to perceive yellow?
아니 때 가서데 파르지 통서 파티 노노는 촌도 동 이업동 뭐부 쉬우지거라 때도 리리니 그게 넬링 탐포 먼저 달린 리리 파 무기 넬링 되게 진 로요라스 그 버거니 뭐부 쉬우지 톰라도 되네 옆에 지금 니도 뭐부 쉬우지거라 때 차성 그 넬링 지키네니 그 넬링 탐포 때 리리 먼저 되네 긴 로요라스
니주 상마 타고 가주요와 디레리 상마 이키니 야두요레스라
거기다 이거 있다 세부지 통하는 세부 통 내년 잡고 말고 돈은 말고 이해 나로 돈은 나로
카도 코로나 로고 요레스. So when we look at that image of Mundgod market, so there are different colors which is projecting into the eye, right? Reflected into the eye. So we have yellow, green, red, and all these different colors. So are there different receptors for all these different colors, which goes into the brain? The information of which goes into the brain.
So the receptors are able to respond to a range of wavelengths of light, and this diagram is going to explain that better.
Tanile tabu dezugi yalin chejura di lapse mindor yalin chidan lo chadures di kana junda that ke mai ke tishidi.
So there are not separate photoreceptors for all of the colors that you can perceive.
Tanda khado kharito aina jo zinudos di khado rela ani nele tabu rede yorla di lawe mares.
Let's just take an example with two different cone photoreceptors.
Tanda ngazugi nyungyip tabu mindor ni leyo chashas ra pesunushanas.
We're going to talk about the green cone photoreceptor and the red cone photoreceptor.
The nilin tabu chi kharila relana khado jangu dishe chi ani nilin tabu maudi bas chashas.
Now, if we're looking at an object that is green, it is emitting light at a wavelength right around here.
Ta kesi jangu ro tangsu thoya juda dindi imbaina koran chugi lapse ditta hoina digas ligi res.
And if we're looking at something that's red, it is going, the light reflected from that red object is going to have a wavelength of approximately here.
Ta sumobu chi ta go sumobu di kesi mau chi khado mau thonggu yoina ani tanda di jo lapse ta hoina lapse khajis ragla hoina digas tragu res.
Now, if we're looking at, so in this case, we're just activating the green cone photoreceptor. In this case, we're just activating the red cone photoreceptor.
단다다 디로 차샤오이나 먼저 디급소 가르치기 올라와이나 먼저 닐린 타봉 요라 웰린 타봉 디 아니 장굴에 디 장굴에 닐린 칭에 디 아니 먼저 쿠진 티요레스 다나시 디로 임바이나 먼저 마울 단다 웰린 타봉 요라 닐린 칭에 디 아니 쿠진 칭 쿠진 티요레스.
If we look at something that we perceive as yellow, it will reflect light that is approximately in this wavelength.
Yellow, right? Yellow. The CO 통와이나스. 먼저 CO 통도가 랍세디 따와이나스라. 랍세디 디가스 요레스. 니 냠도 지간지 냄디다.
So in this case, we're activating both the green cone photoreceptor and the red cone photoreceptor.
다 먼저 CO 통도스. CO 통도가 먼저 꾸마 하리테디 라오나 웰린 타공 장부다 마우지 요스. 디니가 꾸마 테디레스.
And the brain perceives that as yellow.
한 제자 디니가 꾸마 티기요라산 레베기 가리징기 올라와나 CO 임바지 징기요레스.
So it's the combination of activating the three different types of cone photoreceptors that allows us to see many, many different colors.
제자 단다 디페슨 치그라스 딜라드 디순자 꾸긴 칸데 티기요메 딜라 빠베 먼저 카도 민자 마부 쇼시 토안다스 디용요레스.
Have any of you painted?
걔는 리모트 팀용 요에서 가도 춘자 배주시니 리모트라.
And have you mixed paints of different colors together to get a new color?
아니 리모트도 갈라 춘자 민다 테니 아니 춘자 사와스에 디치 체용 요에서.
So, you know, if you mix some green paint and some red paint, you're going to get something that looks similar to yellow.
타케지 춘자 먼저 땅으로스 디당도 갈라 리모트가 춘자 니테오나 페셔나 정부다 마우 니테오나 춘자 카도 디니 테오나 디스 세우도지라고 도스 테마디.
So here your brain is mixing paint.
딜라도 딱 단다 캐랑 레바디 가르치고 올라오나 춘자 된저 테디레스.
Is that clear?
디세우 차솔라스 카도 토에니.
So shall we move up the visual pathway and take a look at the visual cortical neurons and how they respond to light, form, and motion?
타다나 디 귤람 디 샤니 아니 먼저기 타다 통저다 데웨 리슌기 왕자 타bun주라 왕자 타소 디간 드메틱로스 요구다 디단 데웨.
So I want to turn now to some really important studies that were done back in, I would say about 50 or 60 years ago. They were begun in laboratory in the United States by two neuroscientists, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel.
타다나 온자 세리바니 요레스 아리나 롱아주 투주 스모라 보조에 심주 계신부지 비거시에 인스라.
And their mentor had given them the problem of trying to understand how visual information is encoded in neurons in V1.
타다나 먼저 코란조의 기긴기 가리 라가 가르테르 라와나 코란이라 먼저 통조다 데웨 네수주라 디 아니 먼저 레슌기네 V1 라주아 디나 판데스 링규메 디 아니 코란이라 라가 디테셔레스.
And in order to ask this question, they had to use an animal preparation because you couldn't do this in human beings in those days. And they had to stimulate the visual system of the animal while recording using microelectrodes in the visual cortex.
타단다 코란조기 따지 시도가 라고마 롱압주 두중을 밀을 따지 체 롱네디 요마로스 딜라도 이 코란조 소자 심바갈 치고 키요레스 코란조 따지 시도 가르치고라나 미기딜라 니 꾸젠 다미르 티요레스 디 꾸젠 티도 코란조기 니 젤라 레슈나라 체림 카리 두베메디 니 체제요레스 체제요레스.
So the animal was looking at a screen like the board, while they had electrodes in the visual cortex recording from the neurons. And by the way, they did these experiments so the animal was not feeling any pain. We don't have perception of pain in our brain.
다 단당한조 다 심진도 소자도 가르치고 미디 다 단당조 카르본 타요 디로 찍라 다 주고 레스 kuyin ram le ti ro ti ani koran so lo ne di khol su share lana lebo gala su share res si di ani thanda le shu yo ra thonzo da te le shu su share res lo ne di gardu gala thanda ngara zo lebo ro cha sha na sumu gi ne le thabu di yo maras che chan lebe gi su so yo mares.
And they spent many months without getting the neurons in the primary visual cortex to fire action potentials. They couldn't figure out what types of stimuli those neurons were tuned to.
Ta tanda koran zo ku ye dam de du garda lejum ne wa khadu tungu du tares daw mangu sta dires thadu di daw mangu ta wa ne ge nye maras tila du khari ki kengi ta lejum ne wa tungu me jorati wangza ta su den zo khandis lega chi me koran zo siu ji nye tu yo mares daw mangu ta wa ne.
And it turns out that neurons in the brain, and particularly the visual cortex, are very specialized, very picky about the types of stimuli that they will respond to.
Chezanda onze leshun jura tanda leshun tongzo da dewe leshun dinala wangza tasu denzo tanda koranzo kuye khande yeme jura mixe shu konzo damga shu chiyo res kuye mixu ka ne chikrang da me jura dil tane ni koranzo yalen che dil chiyo res kuma shira thegyo mares.
And in these experiments, what they were looking for was the stimulus that would cause visual cortical neurons to fire very fast. So what stimulus properties were these neurons tuned to?
Chezanta tanda wangza tasu denzo gi tanda lejun nubo tungu e jura di tun tu yo maras di eni tun la nganzu gi tanda kuyen la kejo khari bu res la jura di thyo di li res.
And here I'm using the word tuning or tune just the way a musician might tune an instrument so it's in a particular key.
Di la dutta tanda nganzu tune la di dige do jura di khari shiwe la na nganzu di roja tangi de yimba inas koran su roja de dige do as tamune di she di takta le la di do cha de res.
So after many months of trying different scenes of the visual world, of mountains, of clouds, of faces, of animals, they got nothing.
Ta koran su ku ye ri dang ta sa dang ni sim soja dam de gi dong de tu ku ye dam de te ne gi thandu koran su ta je mang bu chiwe ne ke ba su mares.
And in those days, they were using slide projectors, so they had to pull the slide in and pull the slide out. A slide projector where, not a video camera, but an old-fashioned slide projector.
Ta koran su inyama imba ina tanda video de yo marwas manchu slide la ni pheju che chik yore nyima shoguro tap tap jishane ani tibol te yendu pheju chine koran su le adi chires.
And you might be too young to be familiar with this, but slides used to be made out of glass.
Ta da na anzu gi slide la di khari pheju chigor la na she gi su yo tinde slide la res.
So one day they dropped the slide accidentally and it had a crack in it.
Ani she gi su yo ndu gola ni ma chi koran su kharchi la na di ma sa res la bani ma sa du gola ani sera res dila.
And they put the slide into the slide projector, and suddenly the neurons in the visual cortex started firing like crazy.
Ta danda di slide na lo yo ras di na wangza tasu du koran su gi ta sera kher la so ma sa ni di sa cha ni ta du gola koran su kharchi la na da wangza tasu na leju mu go tu no ji ni res koran su.
And they repeated it over and over, and finally they figured out that what the neurons in the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex, really are stimulated by are moving edges.
Dila deta tanda wangza tasu denzo tanda kuma khadu thiyo la na koran su ni jura dila yogu thyo na ani kuma thiyo di ji te res.
So then they designed an experiment to use bars of light that they could stimulate the visual field of the animal with, like this, or like this, or like this, in all different orientations.
koran su gi ta yo ta jura di ani chokha wasan indi shani ani koran su pheju chi res ta jina.
And they were able then to figure out for each neuron that they recorded from, they determined that that neuron had a preferred orientation, that's orientation of the bar, that it would fire maximally to.
Ta koran su gi ta du bala wangza tasu gi khap ta dedang la ora 초로 라오라 초 따두가라 초 데데로 짐바이나 아니 코란수기 레중니버디 중구도스라니 니레스
And if they change the orientation to this, the neuron would not fire.
타단다 초디 케시 데데로 스요이나스라 아니 왕자 타수디기 레중니버 중구요레스.
And so the way that Hubel and Wiesel represented this type of receptive field in the visual cortex is like this. There was an orientation of where the bar of light would excite the neuron, and then there were outside of that region, so on either side, light would inhibit the neuron.
딜라다 유에 담데 담데 코란즈기타 대당 민다 유두발 카브레 딘데 디게레스 디 탄데 왕자 타수이나로다 내당 칸디 차이메 디티오레스.
So when they did the experiment and they recorded from visual cortical neurons, here's a bar in a vertical orientation, and each one of these lines, this represents time, and each one of these lines represents the neuron firing an action potential. So each one of these red bars is an action potential.
Tadi yale khande me ditingu res thiredina di wadi kharlana thuzu ditingu res ganga mauji do maudi ge ani kuranzu ge thuzu rirelani leju libotu me ditingu res.
So you can see that with the vertical orientation of the stimulus, the neuron fired a lot of action potentials, right?
Ta ko yen thanda kesi chodi tawana dinde doji yo nastra di tushinamo di dinde edu gala ani wangza tasu digi leju nibo mambush tun da de sigdos.
So then they turned the slide with the crack in it, or they used a bar of light, and they tested this orientation, same neuron. They tested different orientations, diagonal, horizontal.
Ta chok da medicine ta rest thanda peshana slide jima sani sega keras di ro indu gala koranzo giti segnisha ya shungla sha indi shaba mindo shan ta rest.
So now, instead of responding vigorously to light, when they changed the orientation, the neuron had a weaker response or no response.
Ila tuta yola koranzo yalen te jura di ta du gala yale khashila yale shemba che khashila yalen che mate wa de ni res.
So if you take all the neurons from their experiment that they recorded from, hundreds of neurons, and you plot the number of impulses per second across the orientation, you could see that every orientation, there was a neuron for every orientation. So that many, many neurons, every single orientation is represented, but each one has a very specific orientation that it can only respond to.
Dilada wangza tasu gera mambu res dinala dinala na koranzo gi thanda wangza tasu rere la koranzo gi thanda dedang jura cho mindo cha de res.
So it would be like this. Let's imagine that this row and this row and this row can all raise their hands when I have a vertical orientation, but the alternate rows have to be silent. So let's try the experiment. You're going to be visual cortical neurons.
The kiranzu sama thanda tongzor da jewe tongzor le shungi wangza tasu rere indasta.
Okay, so this row, first row, is tuned to a vertical orientation.
Kiranzu khare thanda dedang jura kandir lawana na shungla da nanadi dele imba chashas.
And this row, second row, you're tuned to a horizontal orientation. And the third row is tuned to a orientation in the middle. Okay, so let's see whether you can act like visual cortical neurons. Show your response by raising your hand.
The kiranzu yalente the contested war lana lava yakan in dasa. The dente himba in su lava kyang.
Yeah. Second row.
You the roll as the
Second row.
tell you the new the
Hands up. Okay. Okay, we have a quiet visual cortical neuron over here. How about this orientation? Third row, hands up. So you're like the neurons in the visual cortex. You can only respond to a very narrow orientation of visual stimuli. So if I presented, just like I did, horizontal, diagonal, or vertical orientations, for the neurons in the front row, you're firing, the number of action potentials that you would fire would be maximal at a vertical orientation and lowest at a horizontal orientation.
다 계란조 차샤오나 킨주 단다 당보디 뭐나 차샤오나 슝라용이라 슝라용이 초디 되어이나 안 계란조기 단다 레주니고 망쇼 뚜르레스 안 대가나시 텔라요 임백업수 안 계란조기 다 레주니고 메어로라 마용쇼기 차기레스.
So Hubel and Wiesel called these cells simple cells because they had a very simple response to orientated bars of light that had particular orientations.
Dilla duta danda yuegi danda chodi dendang de roas di eni kujin chadures dilla yalin chingi da tabung de zoro hanzuki karla warla na tabdo tabung na tasheres.
And it wasn't until they moved to higher levels of visual processing that they found neurons that had more complex receptive fields, and they called those cells complex cells.
The di main beyan danda tongzo tabung da dewe tongzo mala da dewe tabung shimba de yores di ani tis nyozin chingi danda yalin de na mando do nilen tabung manga yores digeri la ani anzo nyozin tabung ni shayores.
Last slide before tea break. So one way of thinking about this is that one way that the visual system analyzes an image like this dog standing next to a post is that these neurons tuned to different orientations will selectively filter out and respond to the different orientations in the image.
Tanda lebegi tanda onza tasu denzo koranzo komdi thela ora di ani cholo wala tigi doas tasu lo wala dilla dugal ani maranzo gi pardo ji thon aina dini ninne su lenda koranzo le wala lingi res.
So just to go back to your tuning, row 1, you can respond only to vertical orientation. So all of the aspects of this image that have lines or edges that are vertically oriented, like this is filtering. If you take this image and you filter out all the vertical lines in it, you see something like this. So for the neurons, the monks in row 1, you would be firing to this aspect of the stimulus, because that's what you're tuned to.
Tanda deep part do chashawana dini ni tanda nesu shungla yudushdo dini tawana dinzu sama nana dinzu shungla ma do gero chagyo ras dini rigi nesu dinzu ledu gola ani tanda pangrim thangbush do keranzu do yibana ta tasu dige rigi ani dini do nesu lingi nesu chagyani di chazang ni chagyani kunzugi dini jilingi res.
And the monks that are in row 2 can only respond to horizontal edges or lines.
And tawana shi pangrim niwala shungi dinzu keranzu yibana onza tasu yimba chashaya ras kuranzu gi tanda par thonye jura mobo dini ni tanda shungla yungi gi nesu jura di rigi di chubu lingi res.
And so you would only respond to aspects of the stimulus that had horizontal edges in it, like this, over here, and over here.
Tanda di kujin chade ras di na lo shungla yungi gi da di chashi jura di la yalin tingi chade res di onza tasu di.
And there would be a third population of neurons, like row 3, that can respond to edges in the stimulus that are on the diagonal.
Tadana onzo kujin tingi gi na lo ta di tabi ras ta kesi odi set ni yoe nesu do yo anas dina chashawana di nesu lingi di tanda pangrim sumba di bas di ani onza tasu dige gi yalin chi res.
So now if I ask the 3 rows of monks with different orientations to respond to this stimulus, which of you would actually be stimulated by this stimulus and fire action potentials?
Tanda keranzu ruga sum yoasa ruga sum chaso tanda di cholo gol tani ra kuriyena dilla duta par tende sto aina keranzu nani mangsho leju nuba tungi mangsho khandi chabi res. 네, 아니 어디 차게 한다.
Who, raise your hand if you think this would be the type of stimulus that would cause you as a neuron to fire.
딱 계란주 단다 딜리시 빠르지 된 도와스 구진 로디 디 구진 나때 아니 차수 언제 차수 계란주 kumathidu yalin te gugu du sambuyona an chakyang chisa te ruga sum di chibula gorda di par diltani di kuyen ra kuyen dil yalin chi gugu yume ra ni kiran zu sum kiras tajo chira chis gochuma se tio gochus chumas
Okay, so some
ta kiran zu imbaina the pani ni kuyen le waina kiran zu imbaina dinde doji le waina ra ni su di ani tha dinde yo waina ra an kiran zu kuma thigi yo res la ra yalin chi res la yalin chi la na onza tasu gi pom di tanda lejum ni botu ma shi ora di che kiran zu imbaina dinde imba dinar ni su dinde do mindu ta ra da kuyen ra ga yalin chi odu chi odu tanda shi kiran zu sumba di imbaina da khare dinde dirwa seg ni yo dinde ne su yo waina ni yalin chi res ta oni ta di la par ju do di par del ta ne kiran zu yalin chi u re ma resa ruga sum yo kiran zu kandi samma yalin chi u re ne chik chi u re ni chi u ro ni kiran su ta ni le an cha kya da yalin chi u re samna
all of you would be responding to this stimulus, but you would be responding to different aspects, different orientations of lines in the stimulus.
yo res sumja yalin chi yo ros in yalin chi sa loga cha de ros dina
Okay, thank you. And I'll see you after tea break.
so je percent je le che yo